Who died first, Adam or Eve? At first glance, it may seem like a simple or even trivial question, but when examined more deeply, it reveals layers of meaning that can transform our understanding not just of the biblical narrative, but of God's divine purpose for humanity. Could it have been Adam, formed from the dust of the earth, who received the direct breath of life from God and was appointed as the first caretaker of Eden? Or was it Eve, created from Adam's rib, the mother of all living beings, whose role in the story is as crucial as it is controversial? The answer, or rather the lack of a clear answer in Scripture, invites us on a journey of discovery. Could the silence surrounding this topic hold a greater meaning? Could the order of their deaths be intertwined with a prophetic purpose that spans the ages? To begin answering this question, we must go back to the very beginning, to the foundation of everything. The Genesis account is not just a creation story. It is a portrait of the initial relationship between God, humanity, and the created world. Adam, formed from the dust of the earth, was not just the first man, but a living representation of the connection between the divine and the earthly. His name, Adam, derives from Adamah, the Hebrew word for earth, symbolizing his unbreakable bond with creation. He was placed in Eden not merely as an inhabitant, but as a caretaker, a worker in the garden, tasked with nurturing and preserving what God had declared very good. But God saw that it was not good for man to be alone, and so Eve was created, not from dust, but from Adam. This detail is more than a symbolic gesture. It is a declaration of unity and interdependence. Eve was not a copy, but an extension, made from Adam's own flesh and bone. She was called the mother of all living, carrying within herself the potential for all humanity. This profound bond and interdependence are central to understanding not only their lives, but also their deaths. However, this state of harmony was disrupted. Sin entered the narrative, not as an isolated act, but as a shared choice. The account of the fall in Genesis 3 describes a moment of doubt and deception, but also of decision. Eve was the first to be deceived, the first to reach for the forbidden fruit. Yet Adam, in accepting the fruit from her, not only shared in the sin, but assumed his own responsibility. The fall was not merely an individual error. It was a collective fracture, a rupture that reverberated throughout creation. And here we begin to grasp the weight of the silence surrounding their deaths. The Bible tells us that Adam lived 930 years before he died, but it says nothing about Eve. Why is the account of her death omitted? This absence is an invitation to reflect. Could her unrecorded death symbolize something greater? Could she represent the continuity of the promise made in Genesis 3:15, where God declared that the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head? Eve, whose life is intrinsically tied to the promise of redemption, may have had her death omitted not by accident, but by design. As we dive deeper into this mystery, we begin to see that it is not just about who died first. It is about what their lives and deaths reveal about God's greater plan. Adam, whose death is detailed, symbolizes the cost of sin and the mortality we all inherit. Eve, on the other hand, remains shrouded in mystery, perhaps to remind us that even in the fall there is hope. Her lineage carries the promise of redemption, pointing to something far greater than death itself. So what does this silence mean? What message does it convey? To understand, we must look beyond the obvious, explore the hidden words in Scripture, and consider how this story resonates within the larger narrative of redemption. And this is only the beginning. Prepare yourself for a journey that will challenge your perceptions, uncover profound truths, and lead you to see the story of Adam and Eve in a completely new light. To truly grasp the mystery of who died first, Adam or Eve, we must return to the foundations of humanity in the Garden of Eden. The story many of us know, often presented as straightforward, is actually a tale filled with complexity, symbolism, and profound implications that shape not just the beginning of human existence, but the destiny of all creation. Adam and Eve are not merely historical figures. They are representations of the bond between the divine and the human, between the Creator and his creation, and between free will and its eternal consequences. Picture Eden, a perfect place where everything reflected God's goodness and creativity. Adam was formed from the dust of the earth, and when God breathed life into him, he became a living soul. He was the first caretaker, entrusted with the garden's upkeep and the naming of the animals. wielding authority granted directly by the Creator himself. But his solitude, even in the midst of such beauty and harmony, drew God's attention. "It is not good for the man to be alone," said the Lord. Thus, in an act that transcends simple creation, God caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep and, from his rib, formed Eve. Eve was not shaped from dust like Adam, she was created from him. This shared origin symbolizes a connection that transcends flesh, a unity that represented God's original intention for human relationships: harmony, interdependence, and love. Eve was called the mother of all living, a title that carries both honor and responsibility. Together, Adam and Eve lived in perfect communion with God, reflecting what the Creator desired for humanity. However, this perfection was disrupted. Genesis 3 takes us to the moment when sin entered the narrative. A cunning serpent, later identified as Satan in disguise, approached Eve. There was no force, only words. Words that planted doubt, twisted truth, and stirred humanity's desire to cross the boundaries set by God. "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" the serpent asked. Eve, confident in her position, responded firmly, but the serpent persisted. "You will not surely die," it claimed. "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." This promise, though deceptive, awakened something within Eve. The text describes how she saw the fruit as pleasing to the eye and desirable for gaining wisdom. And then she ate it. What follows is just as significant. Eve gave the fruit to Adam, and he ate as well. There is no mention of hesitation or questioning. He simply participated. In that moment, everything changed. The harmony they shared with God and with one another was shattered. They realized they were naked, and shame entered the human experience for the first time. Now consider the weight of this act. Eve, who was the first to reach for the forbidden fruit, is often seen as the primary culprit, but Adam's responsibility is equally undeniable. He, who was created first and who received the command directly from God not to eat from the tree, remained silent when he should have spoken up, accepted when he should have resisted. This silence, this complicity, reveals much about human nature, how we often choose the path of convenience over the path of obedience. From this point forward, the consequences begin to unfold. God calls out to them in the garden, and the ensuing dialogue is both a confrontation and an opportunity for reflection. Instead of owning up to their failures, Adam and Eve shift blame onto one another. Adam blames Eve, and Eve blames the serpent. This deflection of responsibility reflects not only the rupture between them and God, but also the fracture in their relationship with each other. What should have been a bond of unity and trust is now marked by tension and accusation. Here, the implications of their choices become evident. God announces the consequences of their actions. For the serpent, there is a direct curse. It will crawl on its belly and eventually be defeated by the offspring of the woman. For Eve, God declares that she will experience pain in childbirth, reflecting the weight of bringing new life into a world marred by sin. Moreover, her relationship with Adam will be altered, introducing dynamics of desire and dominance that were never meant to exist. Adam's curse is different. He is reminded of his connection to the earth from which he was formed. The ground, which once yielded its fruits with ease, will now bring forth thorns and thistles. Adam will have to toil relentlessly to extract sustenance from it, and in the end he will return to the dust from which he came. For dust you are, and to dust you will return, declares God. This sentence not only seals Adam's fate, but also marks the entrance of mortality into the human experience. But who would face this fate first? Adam, burdened by relentless labor and the constant struggle against a cursed earth? Or Eve, weighed down by the emotional and physical toll of her pain, her losses, and her responsibilities as the mother of all humanity? The Bible provides clues, but also leaves gaps. These gaps are not accidental. They are invitations for us to reflect on the deeper meanings of this story. Why is Adam's death recorded while Eve's is not? What does this reveal about the roles they played in God's greater plan? These questions deeper into the mystery. It's not just a matter of who died first. It's a matter of purpose, meaning, and how the lives and deaths of Adam and Eve reflect the destiny of humanity. After the fall of Adam and Eve, Eden, once a paradise of harmony, became a painful reminder of what was lost. The presence of God, who had once walked with them in the garden, now seemed distant. When God confronted them about their actions, it wasn't merely to punish them, but to reveal the inevitable consequences of their choices. And yet, even in the pronouncement of curses, there was a hidden promise, a glimpse of hope that would shape the fate of humanity. God began with the serpent, the instigator of the deception. He declared that there would be enmity between the serpent and the woman, between its offspring and hers. Then came a mysterious prophecy. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. This was the first glimpse of God's redemptive plan. A descendant of the woman would defeat the serpent, though not without suffering in the process. For Eve, this promise carried profound significance, as it meant that despite her failure, her offspring would play a pivotal role in humanity's redemption. However, this hope was accompanied by pain. Eve learned that her role as a mother, vital to the fulfillment of this prophecy, would be marked by suffering. I will greatly increase your pain in childbearing. With pain, you will give birth to children. This was not just a physical punishment. It reflected how sin had distorted even the most fundamental aspects of human life. Motherhood, which should have been an experience of pure joy, was now entwined with pain and sacrifice. But the consequences of sin didn't end there. For Adam, his connection to the earth, once a source of abundant provision, was now a burden. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. Adam would have to fight against the soil to survive. Thorns and thistles would serve as constant reminders that the earth, like humanity, was now in disorder. This curse was not just physical, it symbolized the broken relationship between man and creation, echoing the estrangement between man and God. God's final sentence to Adam was perhaps the heaviest: "For dust you are, and to dust you will return." These words were not just a reminder of human mortality, they were a reminder of the original purpose. Adam was formed from the dust of the earth, and to dust he would return. This reality, absent from human experience before the fall, was now inevitable. Physical death became the ultimate destiny for all humanity. Despite this, there was something intriguing about the narrative. Although God pronounced death as a consequence, Adam and Eve did not die immediately. Instead, they were expelled from Eden. This raises a compelling question. Why did God allow them to live for a time? The answer may lie in the promise of Genesis 3:15. If the descendant of the woman would crush the serpent's head, they needed to remain alive to establish that lineage. Even amidst the consequences of sin, God was already providing a pathway to redemption. The expulsion from Eden was a moment of profound rupture, but also of protection. God placed cherubim and a flaming sword to guard the way to the tree of life. What might seem like punishment was, in truth, an act of mercy. Had Adam and Eve eaten from the tree of life in their fallen state, they would have been condemned to an eternal existence in sin, with no hope of redemption. In His grace, God did not allow this to happen. Now Adam and Eve faced a world entirely different from the one they had known. The ground which once cooperated with them now resisted. Work, once fulfilling, became laborious and grueling. Their relationship, which had been marked by perfect unity, was now fraught with tension. God's words to Eve, "Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you," revealed that even the most intimate human bond had been distorted by sin. As both grappled with their new reality, the weight of their choices became increasingly apparent. Adam, as the first created, bore the responsibility to lead and protect. Eve, as the first deceived, carried the pain of knowing her actions had influenced humanity's fate. Together, they shared the guilt but also the promise. And that promise, though veiled, was a reminder that God had not abandoned them completely. As we follow this narrative, it's impossible not to wonder, how did Adam and Eve cope with this new existence? How did the certainty of mortality reshape their view of life? Who bore the burden of these consequences for longer? These questions lead us to a mystery that continues to intrigue scholars and theologians, the enigma of who died first and what it means in the context of divine redemption. Adam and Eve's new life outside of Eden was marked by unimaginable challenges. The garden, once abundant and harmonious, was now a distant memory, a painful reminder of what they had lost. Each step on the dry, resistant ground was a reminder of the weight of their choices. Adam felt it in his calloused hands as he tilled the hostile soil that grudgingly yielded its fruit. Eve felt it deeply in her soul, especially as she endured the pains of childbirth, which were not just physical but also emotional. The loss of innocence was not merely a spiritual condition, it permeated every aspect of their daily lives. The first significant milestone in their new reality was the birth of their children. Cain, their firstborn, brought a mix of joy and hope, but also a heavy sense of responsibility. When Eve held him for the first time, she uttered words filled with profound meaning. "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Perhaps there was a glimmer of belief that this might be the promised descendant who would crush the serpent's head, but as they would soon learn, that hope would be dashed. When Abel was born, the dynamic between the brothers began to show signs of tension. Cain, a tiller of the ground, and Abel, a keeper of sheep, represented two different approaches to creation and to God. The sacrifices they brought to God became the catalyst for one of the most tragic moments in history. The biblical account tells us that God looked favorably on Abel's offering, but not on Cain's. This wasn't because of the offerings themselves, but because of the hearts behind them. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock, a gesture of devotion and trust. Cain, on the other hand, offered something that seemed more like an obligation than a genuine act of worship. God's rejection of Cain's offering ignited a flame of jealousy and resentment in his heart. Here, sin, introduced into the world by Adam and Eve, began to manifest its devastating impact on human relationships. In his grace, God warned Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." These words echo a universal truth about the nature of sin. It does not force its way in. It waits, patient and persistent, for an opportunity to dominate. Cain, however, gave in. The first murder in human history occurred when he lured Abel into the field and took his brother's life. The impact of this act was devastating. Adam and Eve, already familiar with the pain of their own fall, now faced a new kind of anguish, the loss of one child to death and another to sin. Imagine Eve's agony as she held Abel's lifeless body, feeling the weight of the consequences of her actions echoing through generations. Imagine Adam, consumed by guilt and helplessness, realizing that the paradise they had lost seemed even further away. In this dark moment, God intervened once again, not to punish aimlessly, but to bring justice and preservation. He confronted Cain, asking, "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain's response, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" became a symbol of the human disconnect caused by sin. Knowing the truth, God declared that Abel's blood cried out from the ground, a powerful metaphor for justice demanding restitution. Cain was banished but not destroyed. Even in punishment, God showed mercy, marking Cain to protect him from being killed. For Adam and Eve, the void left by the loss of their children was unbearable. But the story didn't end there. In his faithfulness, God gave them another son, Seth, through whom the lineage would continue. "God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him," said Eve. This new birth brought a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even amidst chaos and pain, God's redemptive plan was still unfolding. And so life went on, marked by cycles of hard labor, loss, and hope. Adam and Eve aged, each wrinkle on their faces a testament to their struggles and the lessons learned. Yet the question remained, who succumbed first to the mortality decreed by God? Adam, bearing the weight of relentless toil and leadership over his family, or Eve, whose emotional and physical pains may have shortened her life? The biblical narrative leaves this question unanswered, but as we delve deeper, subtle clues begin to emerge. What could the order of their deaths teach us about the promised redemption and humanity's ultimate destiny? As time passed, the shadows of Eden became distant, almost unreal memories. Adam and Eve grew older, their lives marked by days of grueling work and nights of silent reflection. Each line on their faces told a story, not only of suffering, but of resilience. They were the first, the parents of all humanity, and they felt the weight of a legacy both glorious and tragic. Adam's days were spent laboring on the land, battling against the stubborn soil that now refused to cooperate. He often reflected on God's words, "For dust you are, and to dust you will return." These words echoed in his mind as he toiled, his hands calloused from the relentless effort required to sustain his family. He knew his strength was waning, each day of work more arduous than the last. Yet Adam did not complain. He accepted his burden, understanding it as part of the consequences of his choices. Eve, on the other hand, carried an emotional burden as heavy as any physical labor. The pain of losing Abel never faded, and Cain's fate remained an open wound in her heart. She often wondered if God's promise would ever be fulfilled. The offspring who would crush the serpent's head seemed like a distant hope, almost impossible to envision. Yet there were moments of joy, times when Seth's children and grandchildren filled the home with laughter, bringing glimpses of life and renewal. But the question lingered: who would die first? The Bible gives us few clear clues, but subtle details invite speculation. Adam, with his intrinsic connection to the earth, bore the physical toll of humanity's burden more directly. His life of hard labor and physical exhaustion may have hastened his mortality. As the provider and caretaker, his constant effort was an unrelenting reality. The phrase, "by the sweat of your brow you will eat your food," was not just a curse, it was his daily existence. On the other hand, Eve seemed to endure a different kind of suffering. The pains of motherhood, both physical and emotional, defined her journey. Her constant reflection on the events of Eden and the role she played in the fall consumed her. She felt a deep guilt, but also a determination to preserve God's promise through her lineage. This mixture of pain and purpose gave Eve a strength that surprised those around her, but at a cost. Could this emotional weight have shortened her life? Despite the adversities, Adam and Eve shared a unique bond. They held a shared understanding that no one else could possess. They had walked with God, felt the fullness of his presence, and lost it all. It was a connection that transcended words, a union that gave them strength to face daily challenges. Yet they knew the end was near, and the mortality they had brought into the world now loomed over them like an inevitable shadow. As we examine this narrative, a deeper question arises. What can the order of their deaths teach us about the larger story of redemption? If Adam was the first to die, it would reinforce his role as the representative of fallen humanity, the first Adam who brought death into the world. Conversely, if Eve was the first to succumb, it could symbolize the sacrifice necessary for the promise of the offspring to be fulfilled, highlighting the role of women in carrying the redemptive lineage forward. This tension between physical mortality and spiritual significance invites us to consider how God transforms even the consequences of sin into opportunities for redemption. Amid darkness, there is always light, a promise that continues to shine. Death, which seemed to be the end, became a reminder of God's greater plan, a plan that involved not just Adam and Eve, but all of humanity. And so life continued. Each day brought new challenges, but also new glimpses of hope. The question of who would die first remained unanswered, but perhaps the focus was misplaced. It wasn't about who would pass first, but how their lives pointed to something much greater than themselves. The story of Adam and Eve wasn't just about loss. It was about the beginning of a journey that would ultimately culminate in the redemption of all. And as we move toward the final chapters of their lives, it becomes clear that their stories still have much to teach us. The years continued to pass, and the weight of mortality became increasingly evident in Adam and Eve's lives. The signs of time were etched into their bodies and souls. Adam, once strong and vigorous, now walked with difficulty, his movements slow, his back bent under the weight of age. Each step he took seemed a struggle against the earth that had once been his ally and now was unyielding. He often gazed at the horizon, contemplating the vastness of the world he had helped populate, yet feeling the emptiness left by the loss of Eden. Eve, on the other hand, felt the passage of time just as deeply, but in a different way. With every new generation born, she witnessed the continuity of God's promise, but also the marks of sin within her descendants. There were quarrels among her children, struggles to cultivate the land, and above all, the pain that human relationships had carried since the fall. She observed it all with a mix of sorrow and hope. She knew redemption was coming, but the wait felt endless. One night, under a sky filled with stars, Adam and Eve sat side by side in silence, as they often did. Adam, his voice raspy with age, spoke of his regrets, but also of his gratitude. Eve, he said, I don't know if we can ever truly make up for what we've done, but I know God has not abandoned us. He has given us children, and those children will have children, and so it will continue until his promise is fulfilled. Holding his hand, Eve replied, Adam, I see it in the eyes of our grandchildren. Even in the suffering, there is a light, a hope that shines. We may not see the fulfillment of that promise, but we know it will come. Yet even amidst this acceptance, one question loomed like a shadow. Who would face death first? The Bible tells us Adam lived 930 years, but it says nothing about Eve's lifespan. This omission is intriguing in itself. Could it be that Eve died before Adam, her death unrecorded to keep the focus on Adam's lineage? Or perhaps her death symbolized something beyond chronological time, something deeper in God's plan. As we reflect on this question, it's important to remember that death for Adam and Eve was not merely the end of their lives. It was the manifestation of the divine judgment they had received in Eden. When God declared, "From dust you came, and to dust you shall return," he was speaking not only of their physical condition, but also of the spiritual consequence of sin. Death served as a constant reminder of their separation from God, but also as a bridge to the promise of redemption to come. And yet, there was something deeply human about their final days. In his later years, Adam became a storyteller for his descendants. He spoke of Eden, not with pride, but with humility. I saw the garden, he would say. I heard God's voice walking among the trees, and I saw how everything can be lost in a single moment of disobedience. The children would gather around him, both fascinated and terrified, grasping the depth of what he described. Eve, on the other hand, spent her days surrounded by her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, teaching them to work with their hands and care for one another. To her, every small act of kindness, every smile, was a way to defy the darkness that had settled into the world. Though she bore the pain of what had happened, she also recognized that her life was a gift, a chance to plant seeds of hope, even in hardened soil. Meanwhile, Adam's health began to decline rapidly. His body, which had endured hard labor for centuries, was now giving way. Eve knew the time was near and cared for him with renewed dedication, cherishing every day they had left together as a precious gift. Yet, in her heart, she also sensed that her own end was approaching. Both of them were aware that their earthly journey was coming to an end, but they found solace in one another and in the divine promise that would transcend their lives. This final phase of their lives leads us to a deeper reflection. What does the death of Adam and Eve signify in the greater context of God's plan? They were the first to experience mortality, but also the first to receive the promise of eternal life through their lineage. Their deaths were not merely an end, they marked a transition, a reminder that even in the consequences of sin, God had planted the seed of redemption. As the twilight of their lives drew near, the meaning of their existence became even clearer. They were not just the first humans, they were living symbols of how God can transform tragedy into hope, disobedience into redemption, and death into life. And so, as their final moment approached, they waited, not with fear, but with a peace born of the certainty that God's plan was greater than anything they could imagine. The final days of Adam and Eve brought an unexpected serenity, as though the weight of centuries of struggles, regrets, and reflections had finally given way to a deeper acceptance. The world around them continued to evolve. Their children and grandchildren multiplied, spreading across the earth, building small communities, and striving in their own way to recreate a fragment of what Eden had been. But for Adam and Eve, the center of their lives was no longer labor or concern for their descendants. It was something deeper, something more spiritual, a sense of purpose that transcended mortality. Adam, his body frail but his mind still sharp, spent more time speaking of God's promise. He shared his memories with those who came to him, especially the younger ones. God gave us a promise, he said, his voice carrying the weight of nearly a millennium of experience. Even when we were cast out of the garden, he did not abandon us. He said that the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head. That promise is why we continue, even amidst the struggles. For Adam, every word was a declaration of faith, a reaffirmation that, despite everything, God was still present. Eve, in her later years, dedicated herself to teaching practical yet deeply spiritual lessons. She taught the younger generations about the importance of caring for the earth, respecting one another, and honoring God in their actions. Though her voice carried the pain of being the first to succumb to temptation, it also carried the strength of someone who had found redemption in God's promise. "We are more than what happened in the garden," she would say. "We are more than our mistake. We are part of God's plan, and that plan is still unfolding." As time passed, the signs that the end was near became more evident. Adam spent more time in silence, gazing at the sky, while Eve increasingly relied on her children and grandchildren for tasks she once performed with ease. Still, they found joy in small moments: the sound of children's laughter, the warmth of the sun on their faces, the simple act of being together. For them, these moments were reminders that God's goodness could still be seen, even in a world marked by sin. Then one day, Adam was overcome by a weakness he knew was unlike any other. He called for Eve and asked her to sit by his side. "Eve," he said, his voice frail but filled with conviction, "my journey is nearing its end. But I want you to know that even in our darkest moments, you were my greatest blessing. God gave us each other, and through us, he gave the world the promise of a new beginning." Eve held his hand, tears streaming down her face, but without sadness. "Adam," she replied, "you were my strength when I needed it most. And though we've faced so many hardships, I know God never abandoned us. His promise sustained us, and it will continue to sustain our children and their children." Adam closed his eyes, a faint smile on his lips. In that moment, he gave up his spirit, or returning to the dust from which he had been formed, just as God had declared. Eve sat beside him for hours, silent, reflecting on their lives and everything they had endured together. Though the pain of loss was immense, she felt a profound peace, knowing that Adam was now at rest and that God's promise lived on. The descendants of Adam and Eve gathered to honor his memory, and the story of the first man was told once more. Even in her grief, Eve remained a pillar of strength and hope. Though she knew her own journey was nearing its end, she continued to speak of God's promise, assuring her children and grandchildren that redemption would come. This moment marked a transition, not just for Eve, but for all humanity. Adam, the first man, had passed, but his story, and Eve's, remained alive, echoing through generations as a reminder that even in the fall, God offered the promise of restoration. As Eve looked out toward the horizon, she felt a deep conviction that her role in the divine story was not yet over, even as the twilight of her life approached. When Eve sensed that her days on earth were drawing to a close, she sought to impart her final words, filled with meaning and reflection, to her descendants. In a rare moment of stillness, surrounded by those who would carry on her legacy, Eve shared her profound vision. Her voice, steady despite her age, carried the weight of experiences and choices that had shaped humanity's destiny. "I saw Eden," she began, her eyes shining with the memory of that perfect place. "I saw the world as God created it, unstained, without pain, and I lived to witness how our decisions shaped the path for all who came after us." The room fell silent. Each of Eve's words wove a thread into the tapestry of their lives, a reminder that the story of creation was etched into each of them. She spoke of regret, but not with bitterness. "Regret is not the end," she said. "It is the beginning of a new journey. God gave us this gift, the ability to learn, to grow, to draw closer to Him, even after we fall." Eve recounted how, even outside Eden, she and Adam had found moments of joy, births that renewed their hope, and a faith that sustained them through adversity. Eve reminded them of God's promise made at the moment of their fall, the promise that one day the serpent would be defeated through the lineage of the woman. "That promise," she declared, "is greater than any mistake we made. It reminds us that despite our failures, God has not given up on us. That promise is for you, for your children, and for their children. Never forget it." When Eve finally closed her eyes and departed from this world, her descendants wept, not just for the loss of the first woman, but for the strength and wisdom she embodied. They buried her beside Adam, and in that sacred place they left the beginning of a story that would echo through generations. It was not merely the end of an era, but a reminder that even in the shadows of the fall, the light of redemption always shone. The story of Adam and Eve does not end with their deaths. It lives on in the pages of the Bible, in the hearts of their descendants, and in God's eternal promise to restore what was lost. It serves as a reminder that we are all heirs to their choices, but also participants in a greater plan of redemption and restoration. Every mistake, every struggle, and every triumph points to the ultimate promise, the coming of a Savior who would bring life where there was death and hope where there was despair. As we conclude this journey, we want to hear from you. How does this story resonate with you today? What lessons can we draw from the experiences of Adam and Eve and apply to our own lives? Are we living up to the promise God made to humanity, striving to connect with the divine even in the midst of challenges? Share your thoughts in the comments. We're eager to know how this story has impacted you. If this narrative touched your heart, we invite you to join our community here at the Eternal Compass. Our channel is a space to explore deeper truths, question the narratives that have shaped our faith, and find inspiration to live lives more connected to God. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. By subscribing, you're not just connecting to stories like this, but also helping bring these messages to more people. Together, we can continue this journey of discovery, faith, and hope. The legacy of Adam and Eve challenges us to seek more, question more, and live lives that reflect the great promise of redemption. And remember, your spiritual journey is not solitary. We're all in this together, guided by the promise that in the end, good will triumph over evil.